Today I want to talk about right story, wrong character. And writers make this mistake very often where you come up with perhaps the story first and you, in retrospect, draw in or paint in the characters to fit it, or you came up with the plot, or you came up with the character first and then you construct a plot around it, right? And where can that go wrong? So how we often think of character is, oh, my character is like my list of, personality traits, or my enneagram, or my list of character questions, or my character is, so and so archetype, all that. But a better way to think of character is that plot is character, and we tend to make this distinction between the two of them when they are often not distinct. What do I mean by that? Basically, plot is what your character does, and I'll illustrate this in a minute. Imagine, for example, take the character James Bond, right? Same character, same James Bond, but James Bond goes to Hogwarts, right? He's just there for some reason. Now, imagine that the events of the Hogwarts school year play out exactly as they do. It's James Bond at Hogwarts, so he's not going to be particularly useful. As not in the way that we get the very best out of James Bond, right? Yeah, and so it's the same character, but placed in a setting where he doesn't belong. He's suddenly uninteresting. Or imagine Forrest Gump, but he's in a Justice League movie. Okay, we've got Doomsday coming down. We've got all those villains. Things are popping off, right? Yeah. Now, you've got the character. You've got all the lovely things about that we know and love, but he won't be very interesting in that scenario. Plot is what the character does, and if the character is put in a scenario where he's an ill fit for the circumstances that play out, you will have a boring character. It's almost non-negotiable.
So I like to compare it to a slingshot or a bow and arrow, right? The further back you pull the string on the bow, the more energy is released when you let go, right? And the more strong the impact will be on the target. In a similar fashion, the further back or the more incredulous the transformation is, right? The further back, the more the character changes, the more impactful it tends to be for the audience when the climax. So, I'm sure you've seen this before. You watch a movie, everything is technically good, still feels mid. Why does this feel mid? Nothing particularly wrong, nothing particularly went awry, but it still feels pretty dry, tepid, room temperature, entertainment. That's partly because the bow isn't being stretched nearly far enough, so the energy released, that emotional impact on you, the viewer, is mild because the transformation was mild. You also see this with sequels, and some sequels fail because of this, pale in comparison to the original, because the center or the most affected stakeholder in that original movie was the protagonist, right? So they go through that change, stretch so far back, and they go from so far back to being where they are at the end of the movie. There's a lot of emotional energy released. It's so impactful. Then there's a sequel. The sequel, it needs an event to happen. Our character has already changed, so sometimes the inciting incident or the center around which the conflict revolves, the tension revolves, will be someone or something many degrees of separation from the main character. And so that emotional impact that we get from the directness of the inciting incident, or the directness of the character arc, or the tension being on the main character, that is no longer there. So you have a bow being stretched like here. Maybe in part 1 it was stretched to like here, right? Yeah. And that's what we're talking about, right? So when you're writing a story, good thing to think about is, who is this affecting the most? Right? Who is this premise most punishing to, right? Who is this premise most torturous to? Who is this premise most founding, most devastating for your main character? Instead of coming up with a character adjacent to the plot and constructing a plot that they can participate in for reasons just because the character is quirky and all that, right? And the truth is, and character is what the person does in the story. So regardless of whatever you have on your, main character sheet list, a character personality being quirky or whatever, if the plot does not bring that out of them, right, through forcing them to make choices, by presenting them with difficult circumstances that compel them to make choices and have agency in the story, move events forward, doubling down on their fear, missing their desire, right? It doesn't matter what you put on that character sheet, it won't have the desired impact on the reader or the viewer. Second mistake that people make in the James Bond goes to Hogwarts thing is constructing set pieces that don't bring the main character in direct confrontation with their fear, desire, or misbelief, right? So you see this all the time in movies where there's like, there's the third act is always a big battle, a big blue sky beam. Let's go battle the alien horde or whatever. I'm not digging on superhero movies. I'm a big superhero movie fan, as you can tell from the examples I've made in this video. If you make a promise that my character's fear/misbelief is this, okay, the climax must be something that brings them into direct confrontation with that fear and misbelief. So if in Act 1 you said, my character's fear and misbelief is stage fright, third act cannot be, they finally get the courage to take an ice bath. And this is why you get many stories where the side character is way more interesting than the main character, because often main character gets a transformation that's like this, right? The difference from start to finish isn't vast, it isn't great. So the energy released when the change happens by the main character is similarly mild, right? But you might get a side character like Prince Zuko with a transformation from point A to point C is so vast that when it finally happens, it is immensely way more satisfying to watch, to enjoy.
I could take the most interesting character you could think of, right? I could put them in, say I put Tony Stark in the Mean Girls universe. Like, same Tony Stark, but in that role, for the plot that plays out in Mean Girls, he's basically not needed or not necessary, or he's not a major stakeholder in the events that play out. That's a good way to think about it, right? So the way you should think about plot is that, is this inciting incident? Is it something that is very punishing to my character? Is it something that is very torturous to my character? Is it something that is very challenging to my character? Bring them at the brink of everything they know, everything they're capable of, the very edge. If not, you probably have the wrong protagonist for that story, right? That's if you have not started drafting yet. But if you have started drafting, I would consider crafting more situations whereby the character is most affected or has the most stakes, right? So how does this play out in movies? And you will often see it in a lot of YA stuff, where the character we follow is not the character most affected by events. So you end up watching the movie going, that was okay, right? That's kind of okay. You see a similar thing that happened with the Fantastic Beasts franchise, where people were complaining that the guy played by Eddie Redmayne, right? People would complain that he wasn't particularly interesting because the main point of incidents of the central conflict in the movie was on Dumbledore Grindelwald. So he wasn't a bad character to follow. I think you could get some gold out of that, but it doesn't grip your audience by the shoulders and pull them in. Like if the story was following maybe someone whose parents were directly killed by Grindelwald, or like if the story was following Dumbledore, who had a very close relationship with him, right? Story doesn't grip you the same way and like pull you in. Now imagine something like Kill Bill, right? Or even the main Harry Potter story where the protagonist's parents directly killed by the antagonist. The antagonist directly tried to kill him and the antagonist was directly stopped by him. There are all points of incidents for the circumstances of the plot directly converge on your character. So the moment we start, it like instantly grips the audience, pulls them along, and there's less of a mountain to climb to be invested. Another place where this crops up is with detective movies, right? This can sometimes get tricky where or you see it with procedurals in general, where the murder of the week or the villain of the week, right, is not directly connected to our protagonist but someone associated with our protagonist, right? And so maybe our detective comes in and then someone's mother has been murdered, and sometimes what happens is by the end of the movie that side character is way more interesting than the main character because more directly affected by the events. Therefore, they are more compelling to follow, like are more compelling to watch, right? So you will see this with a lot of detective thrillers. That's why a lot of them seem flat and like just derivative of each other. Cause a lot of the detective is one of the least affected by the event. Now you can find a way around that by saying, oh yes, they are least affected by the event, but they are most competent to unravel the event. That works. But, and I'm sure you bear witness to this, when the villain is impacting the detective character the most, right, has a direct link to them, the detective character like is almost always, that is the most compelling tale for that detective. You can look at Moriarty with Sherlock, that intellectual rivalry, and the Moriarty stories, arguably the most compelling Sherlock stories. Let's take a look at Batman and the Joker. You have that intellectual butting of heads, and arguably the Joker stories are some of the best Batman stories because it's so directly affected. Some stories even retroactively make the Joker the one that shot his parents. Those stories are very compelling as a result, right? So sometimes you may have a James Bond goes to Hogwarts type of story where yes, it's fine and you can squeeze some minimal amount of compelling drama and engagement from a protagonist that is like 2 or 3 degrees of separation from the central conflict or the inciting incident. Sometimes that can work, and that's if you've not started writing yet. If you tried or contemplated shifting the central focus to be the person most directly punished or affected, or the biggest stakeholder, or the most exposed, the most vulnerable to the inciting incident or the central conflict, if you shifted the focus to them with a story around them, I can guarantee you would have a more engaging story instantly, right off the bat, simply by implication that the person it happened to is the worst possible person that bad events could happen to, right? A good example of this is The Wheel of Time, where the beginning character is a lowly farm boy, and his village gets ransacked by these monsters and they slaughter everyone, and everything he's ever known in his life is ripped away from him in a single night, and he has to step up and do something about it, right? That is the worst thing happening to the worst possible person it could happen to. And with an opening like that, like, I'm instantly hooked. As opposed to, say, the protagonist was a guy 5 villages away who heard about it, who maybe comes into contact with the protagonist and helps them along their way. Now, that's a fine story. You could write something like that. That sounds like the premise of a lot of fine stories, but it's not instantly, immediately gripping, because it is not the worst possible thing happening to the worst possible person it could happen to. You see, yeah. Great examples of this, I'd say, Slumdog Millionaire, The Life of Captain America, the first Captain America, right? I think could make a good Captain America movie following like a regular, 6 foot something soldier. The fact that he is a shrimpy guy at the beginning makes it instantly compelling than it would have been if the narrative had followed a regular guy. Because the fact that he's small, the conflict is instantly apparent from the premise, and that's another advantage when you select a protagonist that is the worst possible thing happening to the worst possible person it could happen to, which is that the stakes are immediately apparent from the premise, right? If I say Shrimpy, sickly looking, is called to fight World War II, premise is instantly apparent. A hiker gets pinned by in a desert and is running out of supplies. The stakes are instantly apparent from the premise. Person is pretending to be a successful coach, and now he has to coach a struggling team that is looking up to him. Premise, the stakes are instantly apparent from the premise, right? A young girl is selected for a battle royale death tournament. A young village girl is picked for a winner takes all death battle. The stakes are instantly apparent from the premise, because that is the worst possible thing happening to probably the worst possible person it could happen to, right? Yeah, so that's the advantage of that. So before you select a premise, before you commit to a story for 3, 4, 5 years, I've been working on my draft for 5 years now, 4 going on 5. Explore that possibility. Also, you might be stuck with James Bond going to Hogwarts type of premise, right? And you're writing a way less interesting story than you could have, and after you get a while into this, they're sort of boxed in. Now, to the people who are boxed in and are locked into setting premises that you're squeezing some juice out of the story, but it's 40% of the juice, right? The story is following someone that is not a direct point of incidence. The character the narrative is following is not the character that is most tortured or most punished by the inciting incident or the central conflict, right? It's just not, and maybe you're too in deep. What do you do? One is just agency, get them active, right? If there's situations like your character let them be active instead of reactive, okay? Merely by the fact that a character is the most active in a narrative, they instantly become likable, even if they're bad or they are morally dubious. I can point to, The Wolf of Wall Street. I can point to Casino. I can point to Goodfellas. I can point to Narcos. Simply by the fact that the central point of focus is the one driving the narrative, making the choices. It's instantly interesting simply because they are active. We want to watch people get active. We want to watch competent people be competent, right? It's the reason why shows like House and Sherlock are successful, even though those protagonists are not the main victims of the crimes or the diseases. simply because they are competent. We love watching competent people be competent. So if you have that kind of story, just get that protagonist active, get them acting, right? And find ways to bring them into direct confrontation with the villains, right? So it could be they were not the ones affected. It's not their parents that got killed or their village that got burned, but they engage in all of the like philosophical debate back and forth with the villains, or the central obstacle, right? So in house, that would be the best philosophical or medical principle to apply in a certain situation, right? So so get them active, and I think that should buff that sufficiently up. So that's it. Right.